I did not kill those women for fun. I did it to gain otherworldly abilities. The words echoed through the courtroom, not like a confession, but like an invocation. Ahmad Suradji, a slender man with unremarkable features, sat calmly as if he had just admitted to planting rice, not to burying 42 women alive in the name of power. The silence that followed wasn't disbelief. It was horror's slow recognition. In Indonesia, the line between the spiritual and the everyday is not always clear. Sorcerers or dukuns are as much a part of village life as farmers or midwives. They bless marriages, cure fevers, curse rivals. But what if that trust, so deeply rooted in culture, becomes a weapon? This is not a story of a monster hiding in shadows. It's the story of a man who walked in daylight, greeted neighbors, and offered blessings with the same hands he used to kill. This is a story of belief, how it can give life meaning or strip it away, how faith can protect or devour. But most of all, this is a story about inevitability, about a boy born into stories of magic and spirits who grew into a man whose identity fused with the darkest parts of those myths. He did not wake up one day a killer. He evolved, slowly, methodically, within the logic of a world that allowed him to. And that logic? It made sense to many. It was whispered in lullabies, passed down through prayers, reinforced in every moment someone knelt before a dukun, hoping to bend fate in their favor. Suradji didn't invent the hunger for supernatural power. He simply followed it to its logical extreme. In the quiet unfolding of this story, we'll trace that evolution. From Suradji's obscure beginnings in North Sumatra to the strange rules of his deadly ritual, we'll walk with his victims, not just in their final moments, but in their quiet hopes that led them to trust him. We'll hear from those who survived him and those who mourned. And when the story ends, you may find yourself not just horrified, but unsettled by how normal it all seemed until it wasn't. Because this isn't just about one man's evil. It's about the echo chamber that made him possible, and the dark places belief can take us when we stop asking questions. And so, we begin with a question. What makes a killer out of a healer? Before Ahmad Suradji became a name spoken with dread, he was simply Ahmad, born into heat and dust in the sun-baked plains of Medan, North Sumatra. His childhood was shaped not by violence, but by silence. Long hours in the fields, nights listening to old stories. A father who was more myth than man. His father, a respected dukun named Ibrahim, was a fixture in the village, a man people feared slightly more than they revered. He wore his knowledge like a shroud, never quite smiling, never quite touching the ground with his feet. People said he could summon rain, speak to the dead, cure madness. To Ahmad, he was a figure of awe and shadow. He didn't tuck his son in at night. He taught him rituals. It's tempting to trace a straight line from that house to the grave-littered cane fields, but reality is never that clean. Ahmad went to school. He laughed. He married. He had children. Yet through it all, there was a tension inside him, like a string pulled too tight, a hunger that ordinary life couldn't satisfy. The village around him fed that hunger in quiet ways. Here, belief wasn't ornamental, it was structural. Spirits lived in trees, ghosts walked in the rain. Every ailment, every heartbreak had a mystical cause, and thus a mystical cure. People didn't go to doctors, they went to men like Ahmad's father. And when his father died, the villagers came to Ahmad, expecting the same answers. He didn't know the rituals fully, but he remembered enough to pretend. Pretending, at first, was enough. He gave blessings, healed fevers, whispered charms, but the role swallowed him. The boundary between performance and power blurred. Eventually, the pretending stopped feeling like pretending. And then, something happened that cracked his world open. He claimed it came in a dream. In that dream, his father stood before him, calm, grave, radiant. The older man's voice told him that to become truly powerful, he must kill 70 women and drink their saliva. Only then would his strength become complete. When Ahmad woke, the message felt more than real. It felt sacred. Skeptics might call it delusion. Psychiatrists would find many terms for it: psychosis, narcissistic fantasy, trauma-driven hallucination. But those labels don't explain why he listened, why he obeyed, because something in him wanted to. This was the pivot. Not the dream itself, but the readiness to believe it. The same readiness he'd seen in those who came to him, with desperate hopes, a mutual transaction of faith. He had always been surrounded by believers. Now he had become one. But belief alone wasn't enough. Belief needed action. It needed victims. And his village, so full of fear and faith, was fertile ground. What Ahmad never confessed, but what seemed inevitable in hindsight, was that the dream gave him permission for something darker already rooted in him. He'd long sensed power was possible, through control, through dominance, even through pain. The dream merely gave his instinct a script. In the months that followed, he began experimenting. Not with murder, not yet, but with rituals that grew stranger, more elaborate. A goat sacrificed not for healing, but for silence. A chant spoken backwards. Ashes buried at thresholds. He said the spirits spoke louder now. He began walking at night. His wife, Tumini, noticed the changes but said little. In her world, a man communing with spirits was not inherently alarming. He became more withdrawn, quieter but also more certain. A strange confidence settled over him, the confidence of someone who believes they've been chosen. That certainty became charisma. And charisma, in a village gripped by quiet desperation, becomes influence. People came to him with problems he had no training to solve: infertility, bad luck, family curses. He spoke less of herbs and more of fate, less of healing, more of power. And slowly they began to believe. He was no longer just Ahmad, the son of a dukun. He was Datuk, a man who had stepped beyond tradition into something deeper, darker, and, for those willing to pay the price, more powerful. All he needed now was proof. A single ritual to confirm what he already believed, that he had crossed the boundary from man to vessel, that the spirits had accepted him. That moment was coming, and when it came, it would come not in chaos, but in control. He wouldn't lash out, he would prepare, select cleanse, speak the words as he had been taught, or as he believed he was taught, and afterward he would not feel shame, he would feel affirmed. Because belief is not only what we accept, it's what we're willing to do for the world we imagine is true. And for Ahmad Suradji, that imagined world required sacrifice. One woman, then another. The path had opened, and he had no intention of turning back. The tragedy of Ahmad Suradji is not only that he killed, it's that he was trusted. Long before he was feared, he was believed in. As the years passed, Suradji's role in the village transformed from that of a dukun's son to a spiritual authority in his own right. People called him Datuk, a title that implied honor, lineage, and power. His presence became a fixture, quiet, measured, always wrapped in spiritual gravity. His home became a place of pilgrimage, Women came from neighboring towns with offerings, candles, coins, cigarettes. They brought their problems in whispers. Marriages gone cold, businesses stalled, wombs that refused to carry. And Suradji listened. He always listened. That was part of his genius. He said little, but he heard everything. He never promised miracles, only results. And that ambiguity gave him credibility. He understood what people needed to hear. He crafted his rituals like theater. A bowl of water here, a chant in an unfamiliar tongue, a bundle of leaves bound with red string. It didn't matter that his methods weren't inherited from his father in full. What mattered was the illusion of continuity. He carried himself like someone carrying ancient truths. What his client saw was a man of discipline. He rose before dawn, worked in the sugarcane fields, fasted on sacred days. He spoke rarely with intention. His hands were calloused, his face unadorned. There was nothing flamboyant in his demeanor. That simplicity worked like camouflage. He did not look dangerous, he looked devout. Behind closed doors, the story was different. He kept careful records, names, dates, small drawings in the margins. These weren't ritual notes, they were markers, flags in a growing map of power. Every woman he helped, everyone who returned, became part of a ledger in his mind. He watched. He learned patterns. He knew who would speak and who wouldn't, who had family nearby and who was isolated, who was desperate enough to accept any ritual, no matter how strange. One of the unspoken contracts between dukun and client is secrecy. A woman would not boast of her visit to a sorcerer. It was a private shame, an intimate desperation. That secrecy protected Suradji. It was a veil he encouraged. His rituals began to shift. Longer sessions, stranger requests, touching the soil with bare skin, being buried up to the waist, drinking blessed water under the moonlight. To outsiders, these might have seemed like dangerous red flags. But to believers, they were signs of authenticity, evidence that the ritual had power, that it wasn't merely symbolic, but visceral. Most of the women who visited him never returned, and most of them were not missed, not right away. That's the painful part. The ones who went alone, who told no one, who carried their shame with silence. Their disappearances didn't ripple through the village. They vanished as quietly as they had arrived. The sugarcane field became his chapel, a place of rites and sacrifice. Its tall, rustling stalks whispered secrets only he could understand. He walked those paths like a priest through pews. Each spot, each shallow grave was chosen with care. There's no record of anyone suspecting him, not in those early years. Why would they? The village had no framework for a killer like him. Evil, in their understanding, was an outside force, a possessing spirit. It wasn't supposed to look like someone who blessed your child. Even when someone did disappear, the assumption wasn't murder. It was misadventure, elopement, spiritual imbalance. Perhaps the ritual had backfired. Perhaps the woman had crossed a boundary the spirits disapproved of. Grief turned inward. It's easy to blame the villagers now, to ask how they didn't see. But faith has a way of building walls around what it protects, and those walls become harder to break when the faith is old, communal, and unquestioned. Suradji did not need to hide in the shadows. He built his power in plain sight, layered in ritual, protected by silence, justified by belief. And it worked. For nearly 2 decades it worked. The true terror of his story lies not in the acts themselves, horrific as they were, but in how long they remained invisible. Even the few who sensed something wrong had no language for it. Suspicion felt like betrayal. And besides, what evidence was there? Just rumors, whispers. A woman seen entering, then not seen again. But the world was full of migrations, of women leaving for work, for shame, for love. Who could say what happened for sure? There were no screams in the night, no blood, only absence. And in a culture steeped in spiritual modesty, absence was rarely interrogated. It was prayed over. It was this quiet complicity of culture and fear that kept the bodies buried and the truth untouched, until one girl did not return, and someone noticed. Her name is lost to history, or at least it was never publicly confirmed. So for the sake of this story, we'll call her A. She was young, barely 20, and she had come alone. She believed she had been cursed. Her fiancé had left her. Her family had fallen into debt. She couldn't sleep without hearing voices in the trees. She believed her soul had been tied in knots by someone jealous, someone cruel. She wanted help. She wanted relief. She came to Suradji in the quiet part of morning, when the village was still wrapped in mist, and the sugarcane stalks had not yet warmed. She bowed her head as she entered. She handed him a small parcel, 2 cloves of garlic, a silver ring, and a photograph of herself. Her eyes in the photo looked heavier than her body. He told her the spirits were angry. He told her there was a cleansing ritual, but it required complete trust. She said yes. He led her to the field, feet bare, the ground damp. He gave her a cloth to tie around her waist and instructed her to remove everything else. He told her to lie down in a shallow trench he had dug earlier, just wide enough for her body. The soil was cool and sticky. He began to chant. She did not scream. Later, when asked why he began with her, he said, "She looked like someone who needed it." And that word, it, was not defined, not even to himself. He believed her death would bring power, and her saliva would carry her life force into him. But there was more, something unspoken. A compulsion, maybe, or a kind of hunger. The ritual gave him a reason, a container. He strangled her slowly, methodically, watching the light change in her face. When it was over, he covered her with earth, not too deep, just enough. He walked back to his house and ate a small meal. He felt calm, no thunder, no voice from the sky. But he felt stronger. Or he told himself he did. In the days that followed, he noticed something strange. He smiled more. People around him laughed at his jokes. One woman returned to thank him, convinced that his charms had worked. That coincidence confirmed everything. The next woman came 2 weeks later. By then, the trench was already prepared. The cane field stood still for days after that. He avoided it at first. Not out of guilt. He never described feeling guilt, but from caution. Like one waits after planting, unsure if the soil will accept the seed. He watched the weather, took longer walks, noticed that the birds didn't scatter from his path as they once did. Small signs, confirmation bias perhaps. But to Suradji they were affirmations. What was most dangerous wasn't that the murder changed him. It was that it didn't. Life continued, unbroken. His wife noticed nothing strange. The villagers came with new problems. No one asked about the girl. No one came looking. That silence was the answer he needed. He began writing things down, dates, names, moons. He drew symbols he didn't fully understand, shapes seen in dreams. He began to refine the ritual, a certain time of day, a certain way to bind the wrists. He believed the earth responded better when the body was facing east. He wasn't just killing, he was crafting a pattern, a blueprint for power. And each time he returned to the trench, each time he dug a new one, it became easier. The fear was gone, replaced by method, repetition, a rhythm to the madness. The women kept coming. They were never dragged, never forced, always led. Some carried hope like a talisman, others barely looked up. Many were told not to speak of the ritual, and they agreed. Trust was already a form of silence. To this day, we do not know if any tried to flee. There are no reports of struggle, no signs of disturbance in the cane. Perhaps they didn't believe they were in danger until it was too late. Or perhaps they couldn't believe it at all. It's that impossibility, the refusal of the mind to accept danger in a sacred space, that gave Suradji power. His field was consecrated in the minds of his victims. They did not enter expecting death. They expected healing. They expected light. He offered a grave instead. And as he smoothed the dirt with calloused hands, he looked up at the sky, watching for a sign, not of remorse, but of reward. It never came in thunder or light. It came in whispers. Weeks later, when another woman knocked on his door, and he told her gently, "Yes, the spirits will help you. But first, you must follow me." She followed. Like the first, like the others. And with each footstep, the ritual deepened, not in mystery but in precision. A machine of belief, fueled by silence. The pattern began to emerge not in bodies, but in silence. For years, the women who came to see Ahmad Suradji did so quietly. Some told their families they were going to market. Others said nothing at all. This secrecy wasn't suspicious. It was expected. The rituals were private. The desperation they carried was deeply personal. So when they didn't return, there was no outcry, just unease. It started small. A sister mentioned her sibling hadn't come home. A neighbor remembered someone asking for directions to Datuk's house. A mother waited an extra day before lighting a candle. But no one connected the dots, not yet. The sugarcane fields swallowed their dead with efficiency. Shallow graves beneath the rustling stalks. No vultures. No stench that reached the village. Just the hum of wind through green corridors. Meanwhile, Suradji's routine never faltered. He greeted his neighbors, tended his livestock, whispered prayers in the morning fog. He moved like a man unburdened by secrets, and perhaps, in his mind, he was. Because this was no crime spree, it was a ritual calendar. He kept a balance between appearances and appetite. Sometimes weeks would pass between killings, sometimes only days. He kept careful track. He had a number to reach, 70. He would never make it that far. But long before his arrest, a rhythm had set in, a ritualistic loop. A woman arrived. She performed the steps. She trusted. She died. She vanished. Each death reinforced the illusion. The field became layered not only with bodies, but with confidence. Confidence in his power. Confidence in the silence that followed. Confidence that the spirits approved. And then there were the things he began to see. Shadows moving at the edge of the field. Birds circling overhead that hadn't been there before. Dreams where the women spoke to him, not in protest, but in approval. He believed himself chosen, not insane, not evil, but anointed. And in that belief, the pattern became prophecy. Sometimes the villagers whispered of ghosts, not just the kind that floated through legends, but ones that felt recent, restless. There were reports of dreams shared by multiple women, of being watched in the fields, of a presence breathing just behind them. These murmurs never reached the authorities. They remained trapped in kitchen corners under breath, filtered through incense smoke. They weren't taken seriously, but they were warnings. The truth was waiting in plain sight. yet shrouded by reverence. Few dared question a dukun, especially one who maintained his rituals with such visible care. The offerings in his courtyard never ceased. Chickens clucked in their pens. Salt lines marked his thresholds. He prayed more than most. It was easier to believe the missing women had run away or angered the spirits than to imagine something darker. Darkness had a script in the village, and this wasn't it. But questions began to grow teeth. When a woman named Sri Kamala Dewi vanished, things changed. She was young, well-known, and uncharacteristically open about her visit to Suradji. A rickshaw driver remembered dropping her off. She hadn't arranged a ride home. This time, people remembered. This time, someone connected the silence to a name. Still, even then, it didn't feel like a crime. Not yet. It felt like a breach of ritual, a spiritual failure. But the air shifted. Something invisible crossed the threshold. The pattern had become too large to ignore, and somewhere in the fields, beneath layers of ritual and rot, the weight of all those vanished voices was beginning to press upward. The dead do not rest when their story is unfinished. The moment the myth began to crack was small. A body found in the sugarcane field was not destiny. It was proof. In April 1997, a 21-year-old woman named Sri Kamala Dewi vanished after visiting the home of Ahmad Suradji, known locally as Datuk. A rickshaw driver who had dropped her off told the police she had asked him not to return for her. When her body was discovered 3 days later, half buried in the cane, the field turned from backdrop to crime scene. At first, investigators treated the case as a disappearance, but inside Suradji's house, they found her handbag, dress, and charm bracelet hidden away. Slowly, the burden of belief gave way to the possibilities of evil. Villagers and officials alike felt a shift. The world they believed in, one where spiritual healers held power and the unseen adhered to ritual, suddenly looked different. The healer might have been the predator. The trusted figure might have borne secrets. Doubt crept into the cracks of faith. Suradji maintained a composed exterior, but the interrogation revealed fissures. He confessed to Dewi's murder and went on to admit the deaths of 42 women between 1986 and 1997. The weight of one body unearthed spiraled into dozens. The sugarcane field was not just ground. It was grave, ledger, shrine. For the first time, the ritualistic veneer began to lose its shine. Investigators uncovered how the victims had been buried waist-deep, then strangled. Their heads, aligned toward Suradji's house, formed a grim invocation of power. The pattern had emerged from silence into forensic detail. But even as evidence mounted, many in the community balked. How could a healer do this? How could belief mislead so many? Some argued the police were defaming tradition. Others whispered that someone must have framed the dukun. The faithful clung to hope that the familiar figure was still protector, not predator. Yet the facts refused to be soft-padded. Forensic teams exhumed the bodies. Decay and time made identification difficult, but the sheer number was undeniable. The myth of infallibility faltered under measurement and measureless horror. It was in the process of unveiling that the greatest revelation came. This wasn't just about a deranged individual. It was a system in which belief, silence, isolation, and desperation converged. People sought help where they should have sought accountability. Trust became vulnerability. The community's moral equilibrium wavered. Families questioned whom they trusted. Villagers asked how rituals could be weaponized. Authorities wondered how long the pattern could continue unchecked. And Suradji? He remained strange. detached, though less composed. The myth that had held him strong now trembled under daylight. In the end, discovery doesn't always bring closure. Sometimes it brings a new kind of question, one that lingers in the wind through the sugarcane. What happens when the person you trust to heal you is capable of destroying you? And just like that, the healer's name became a warning. When the officers entered the house of Ahmad Suradji, they came expecting questions. They left carrying a weight they never anticipated. The turning point arrived in the late afternoon of the 30th of April, 1997, when the rickshaw driver's testimony broke open what had been a whispering corridor of fear. One woman had vanished. A body was found in the sugarcane field. The evidence began pointing to the dukun. Suradji sat calmly. He greeted the investigators with bowed head, eyes clearing and obscuring in equal measure. The police found the young woman's belongings, her handbag, dress, charm bracelet, hidden in his house. It was the first tangible link between ritual and death. When confronted with those items, the mask slipped. His responses moved from silence to calculation, from deflection to confession. In interviews, he said he had carried out the killings according to a vision, a dream in which his father told him to kill 70 women and drink their saliva so he could become a true mystic healer. He admitted the first murder in 1986 and confessed ultimately to 42 victims. But the confession wasn't dramatic. There were no high-pitched screams of truth or breaking down in sobs. It was flat, matter-of-fact. He described the field, the trenches, the ritual steps as though he were reciting a recipe. The ground was to be prepared, the body placed face to his house, the wrists bound, the throat strangled, then the victims buried waist-deep. As the investigation unfolded, the forensic teams descended on the sugarcane field behind Suradji's home. Bulldozers, shovels, and late-night lights turned a once quiet plantation into a scene of horror. 42 bodies were exhumed, each one a confirmation of a ritual, each one a nail in the coffin of innocence. The impact reverberated through the community. The myth of the reliable healer cracked. Neighbors who had once whispered blessings now whispered fears. Families who had trusted the dukun found themselves victims of a system they did not understand. The police, for their part, faced a challenge: how to prove what belief had masked for so long. Suradji's demeanor during interrogation was unnerving. He claimed not to hate the women, nor to act from anger. He claimed to act from necessity. His logic was his own, rooted in dreams, superstition, power, fear, and by his admission, carried out with precision. He had been in control. He had not lost himself. He had assumed a role. The revelation of the bodies did more than bring closure. It brought questions. What kind of man draws power from death? What kind of community allows a strange stillness to linger when women stop returning? The ghosts of that field spoke not in roars, but in the hush that followed each disappearance. Ultimately, the interrogation transformed the narrative. This was no longer a healer's secret. It was a serial killer's confession. The ritual facade fell away. What remained was a pattern of trust betrayed, silence weaponized, power claimed in blood. And yet the question remained for all who watched. How many more had slipped through the cracks? How many more would never be counted? The field had given up its dead, but the story, it whispered, would not die. The sugarcane field behind Ahmad Suradji's house quietly became a graveyard, not just of bodies, but of belief. And while the stalks rustled in the wind, the ground held something far heavier, the weight of trust betrayed. Over time, what looked like a trusted healer's backyard turned into a monument to silent suffering. When investigators exhumed the field, they uncovered 42 bodies, buried up to the waist, their heads aligned toward his house. The method was ritual, the site sacred in his mind. For the villagers, it became a wound they could never fully close. The quiet places where children once played and women once walked in hope now stood as reminders of the vulnerability of faith. Families arrived, tentative and trembling, confronted with the evidence that the person they handed their desperation to had handed instead death. The dukun, who combed the fields for blessings, had dug the graves. The ceremony that promised deliverance became the site of destruction. Silence that once served the ritual became the ally of horror, because many of the missing women hadn't been reported. Their disappearances happened behind closed doors. A woman visited at dusk, never returned, no alarm. It was trust, not fear, that cloaked the scene. The field became a symbol of gross misinterpretation, of what happens when tradition provides cover for atrocity. The community's worldview cracked. The healer was no longer the guardian. He was the predator in plain sight. And yet the glass of trust shattered without an explosion. It simply turned to dust when touched. In the end, the graveyard of trust raises a question. What remains when the sacred space is profaned? When faith is exploited? When the one we believe to protect us is the one who sets the trap? The answer lies not in the bodies alone, but in the looking back. The women who walked in seeking solace left pieces of themselves behind. Unmarked graves, missing names, unanswered prayers. The villagers who slept believing in a protector now wake knowing a destroyer walked among them. That field remains. The cane grows taller each season. The wind still sighs through its leaves. But beneath its calm surface lies the memory of 42 lives, and a lesson far harsher than any ritual could have prepared them for. That trust, once broken, kills more quietly than the blade. Evil often hides behind conviction. In the case of Ahmad Suradji, belief wasn't incidental. It was his tool, his lifeline, and ultimately his weapon. To understand how a seemingly benign village dukun became a record-breaking killer, we must examine how his spiritual authority and cultural context became the scaffolding for atrocity. Suradji operated in a society where spiritual leaders were trusted to heal, advise, protect. He didn't upset that world, he folded into it. By stepping into the role of the mystic with earned respect, he transformed faith into a mechanism of control. His victims walked to him seeking solace and risk-free power. They didn't step into danger, they stepped into faith. The boundary between ritual and manipulation dissolved. Trust becomes vulnerability when the trusted wears the guise of salvation. Suradji's rituals, meticulously orchestrated, harnessed that dynamic. The victims were not attacked in the dark, they entered fully believing. The field, the cane, the shallow graves, they weren't random. Each setting reinforced his role as spiritual intermediary. He weaponized their hope, their fear, their belief in unseen worlds. In his mind, it was service. In theirs, it was salvation. In reality, it was slaughter. Psychologists might call it charismatic manipulation, someone who builds authority, gains credence, then leverages both for personal ends. Anthropologists might say it's the corruption of myth, when cultural reverence becomes a veil for brutality. But whatever the label, the mechanism is clear. Genuine belief structures invested power, and Suradji turned the trust of those structures into his own agenda. The worst part is not that he killed. Many kill. It's that he killed with their permission. Their silence, their reverence, their unquestioning acceptance gave him the opportunity. Evil did not appear unannounced. It emerged through ritual, through contract, through agreement. The slow burn accumulation of victims was possible because the machine of belief was already running. When authorities finally intervened, the uprooting of that belief system was more traumatic than the arrests. Families found that what they had called healing was disguised death. A village realized the guide they trusted didn't guide. They consumed. The horror wasn't only in what Suradji did, but in how he made the community complicit in silence through faith. In the end, understanding Suradji's evil means understanding how belief itself can be wielded. When faith is absolute, critique becomes taboo. When trust is unquestioned, warning signals fade. And when ritual becomes routine, monsters inherit the mantle of respect. Belief is not always benign. In Suradji's case, it was the weapon. The man once known as Datuk, the spiritual guide, the healer, the trusted figure in the village, stood in the courtroom, sleeves rolled up, face weathered. Ahmad Suradji, the dukun who built an empire on belief, now faced the consequences of the truth. The 42 victims, the shallow graves in the sugarcane field, the ritual that promised power but delivered death. It all came crashing down. Families of the missing women gathered, their desperation now mingled with anger and grief. They waited for names to be spoken out loud. They waited for the earth to release what it had swallowed for years. They waited for justice. But even when justice came, the wounds remained. Many asked not just who did this, but how they had believed. Suradji was executed in 2008. His body was buried in a local cemetery, but the burial sparked outrage. Villagers demanded his remains be removed and reburied elsewhere, unwilling to let the ground in their community hold him. They feared his spirit, or the stain of his deeds, might linger. The ordinary soil now held extraordinary evil. In the years that followed, the case of Suradji became a cautionary tale. It forced a society built on spiritual trust to look at the fragile line between faith and exploitation. The role of the dukun, so deeply embedded in rural Indonesian life, was scrutinized. How many healers practiced in good faith? How many dispensed hope with hidden conditions? The system of blind faith cracked, and while it didn't collapse, it shifted. Yet the most lasting aftermath wasn't legal or institutional. It was emotional. Mothers who sent their daughters to the dukun now hesitated. Women seeking help didn't just pray, they asked questions. The sugarcane field remained. The cane still rustles in the wind. But now, when villagers walk by, they pause, not just out of fear, but because they remember. They remember how trust can become tyranny. In the end, the story of Ahmad Suradji is a reminder that horror doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a robe of reverence, and sometimes the one we trust the most is the one we watch the least. Legacy is not always what we build. Sometimes it's what our silence allows. If you found this story compelling and want to dive deeper into hidden histories and dark truths, hit that subscribe button and join us for the next one. This was Midnight Horror Society, dark curiosity for sleep. Until your next midnight session, sleep well.